It is a personal pleasure and honor to welcome, in the name of the Classics Department of Tel Aviv University, Sir Geoffrey Lloyd of Cambridge University, the 2013 Dan David Prize Laureate in the pastime dimension. Last night at the awards ceremony, we heard a great deal about Sir Geoffrey's virtues and accomplishments. And last night, he himself gave a very edifying talk on the importance of humanity, both because of our limitations as human beings and because of our capacities as human beings. This morning, we move to a format which many Greeks, especially those engaging in philosophy, believe to be a better method for gaining understanding and insight, and that is dialectic, from lecture to dialectic. So Geoffrey will be in dialogue with 4 scholars and scientists on the cutting edge of their very modern fields. And their fields, although described by Greek names, were not imagined, nor perhaps could have been imagined, by the ancients. Cytotaxonomy, lithics, paleoecology, epigenetics, behavioral ecology, although especially after the discovery of the Archimedes palimpsest, we should probably avoid arrogant modernist statements about what the ancients could or could not have imagined. But despite the advanced, sophisticated areas of science represented here at this table, the main subject is in fact as old as Greek civilization, the opposition of physis and nomos, here translated as nature and culture, culture not being paideia, of course, but a kind of a constructed society. And ancient Greek culture, ancient Greek literature is, of course, suffused with this. No more poignant reflection on human culture can be found than the chorus, in famous or notorious, depending on your point of view, in Sophocles' Antigone, which praises human works and culture. The chorus calls man or human beings pantoporos, aporos epudan erchetai tomelon. In Jeb's translation, he has resource for everything, pantoporos. Lacking resource in nothing, he strides towards what must come. From death alone he shall procure no escape, but from baffling diseases he has devised flights. But then the chorus goes on. Sofonti tomechanoen techna super elpid echon, totem men kakon, alot epestlon herpe, nomus gerayon chthonos theon ten orkon dikan hupsipolis. Possessing resourceful skill, a subtlety beyond expectation, he moves now to evil, now to good. Now to evil, now to good. Totem en kakon, alot epestlon herpe. When he honors the laws of the land and justice of the gods, to which he is bound by oath, his city prospers. Hupsipolis. And it is just such ambiguities, questions, problems, hazards, for which we need philosophy and a deep study of humanities and dialogues, such as the one we anticipate this morning. I now turn it over to Dr. Orna Harari of the Philosophy and Classics departments of this university.
It is an honor and a personal delight to hold this roundtable with the Dan David Prize Laureate, Professor Geoffrey Lloyd. The Dan David Prize was given this year for the study of the modern legacy of the ancient world. I assume that the rationale behind this choice lies in the saying, often uttered and heard, that classical culture is at the roots of Western civilization. If I need to say in one sentence how Professor Lloyd transformed our understanding of classical thought, I say that he taught us that this saying is not a cliché. He brought to light the importance of the study of classical thought, not by finding the germs of modern ideas in the writings of ancient thinkers, as many of his predecessors did, nor did he treat classical writings as the ideal to which we should aspire, as the humanists did. Rather, he approached classical writings from an anthropologic perspective, thereby showing us that they contain invaluable data from which we can learn about human thought in general. A representative example of this approach is found in Professor Lloyd's book, Cognitive Variations, Reflections on the Unity and Diversity of the Human Mind. In this book, Professor Lloyd addresses the question whether culture can be explained in terms of nature, or in other words, whether we can ground human culture in our biological constitution. In addressing this question, Professor Lloyd used material from his vast and diverse studies in Chinese ancient sources, showing that they cast doubt on attempts made by modern biologists, anthropologists, linguists, and others to regard perception, language, emotions, and other aspects of human behavior as a universal and natural. In this roundtable, Geoffrey Lloyd will continue this dialogue between classical thought and modern social and natural sciences with the evolutionary biologist, Professor Amos Zehavi, the anthropologist, Stephen Rosen, the linguist, Daniel Dor, and the philosopher of science, Chava Eva Yablonka. I'm happy to invite Professor Lloyd to open this discussion.
Thank you very much. Where do I stand up? Well, first of all, may I say how delighted we are, my wife and I. This is the first time we've come to Israel, and the welcome is fantastic. And we have lots of old friends here, and we're making many new friends day by day. So we're extremely grateful for that, as well as for the enormous honor and amazing opportunities that the Dan David Prize has given us. Excuse me. I don't know which of my spectacles I need for this. For decades, even centuries, the West has been obsessed with a dichotomy between nature and culture and its many variants, nature and nurture, nature and custom or convention, and so on. It seems as if we've been unable to do without these antitheses, which have been used, among other things, to underpin claims for the objectivity of science, securing it from any suspicion of subjectivity or any whiff of relativism. Cultures may vary, but nature is universal. But now that seemingly foundational articulating framework has been challenged in biology, in ethology, in sociology, in social anthropology, in philosophy of science itself. Many of you know far more about many aspects of these questions than I do. I am no expert in the plasticity of genes, though I read about that with fascination. I haven't studied the behavior of non-human animals in the wild or in the laboratory, though again I read with interest about their techniques of communication, social hierarchies, and other points that indicate what may be called their cultural lives and interactions. I've undertaken no ethnographic fieldwork, though my studies of ancient societies do exhibit some common features, as well as differences from the work of those who have, particularly when it comes to the matter of understanding apparently quite alien systems of belief and practice. Rather, it's as a historian and philosopher of science that I can, I hope, make a contribution. In this brief talk, I shall try to respond to all these new developments and to take stock of what remains, if anything, of the usefulness of that dichotomy. Excuse me. Let me begin with what has been called the ontological turn in social anthropology. I'm not sure how familiar you will be with this, but some pretty radical ideas have been proposed in recent years by Philip Descola and Eduardo Viveros de Castro especially. Both have done fieldwork in Amazonia, but both range widely over the whole domain and tackle the big problems with understanding that anthropology faces. Both, incidentally, contributed to the special number of interdisciplinary science reviews that was devoted to my book, Cognitive Variations. Descola focuses on the very different ideas and practices associated with interiority and physicality that the ethnographic evidence throws up. Interiority relates to personhood, the self, what it feels like to be you, while physicality is a matter of bodies and what things are made of. In each case, the emphasis may be on continuities or on discontinuities between humans and other beings. This double differentiation yields a fourfold schema, for which he uses the labels animist, though not in Tyler's sense, totemism, adapted from Lévi-Strauss, analogism, and naturalism. Thus, in the animist schema, interiority, selfhood, is common. It's not just humans who are persons, while physicality is what differentiates different kinds of beings. We are who we are, and jaguars are what they are, because of the bodies we each possess. In totemism, the continuity between humans and other beings is assumed in both the interiority and the physicality axes. Analogism, which Descola detects in both ancient Greece and China, incidentally, assumes discontinuities on both these axes, but sets up correspondences between the domains thus differentiated. Finally, there is naturalism, where physicality is unified, but interiority divided and discontinuous. This view insists on differences between humans and non-humans on the interiority axis in respect of mind and cognitive faculties. Humans alone have culture in the strict sense, according to this view, but humans and non-humans are united by their shared physicality. We're all made of the same stuff. You recognize the ontology that has been dominant in the West. Descola arrived at this tetradic, fourfold schema after first proposing a triadic classification, omitting analogism, but in its current form, in Beyond Nature and Culture, and might I just say that my wife is the translator of that book into English, and the book has now been published about 3 or 4 weeks ago by University of Chicago Press. It's a fairly large book, but I hope you'll enjoy reading her translation. In its current form, it looks, this classification, somewhat a priori, or at least abstract. And that reveals Descola's structuralist background and Lévi-Straussian legacy. Lévi-Strauss was his doctoral supervisor. In practice, it has been urged on me, none of these ontologies exists in a pure form. They're not ontologies in the manner of Plato or Kant, but rather Weberian ideal types. And their usefulness depends on the correlations they allow us to perceive between each schema and the relations of exchange, sacrifice, predation that it favors or that it inhibits. There's some interesting remarks about which cultures with which kind of ontological schema do practice sacrifice. However, for my immediate purposes here, the principal point is clearly that naturalism, far from being the unique, and dare I say natural, mode of interpretation of interiority and physicality, is just one of a variety of such modes. Its assumptions are contradicted in the other three schemata. In animism, for instance, humans and non-humans share personhood. What separates is the bodies that different beings inhabit. A similar point is made even more forcefully by Viveros de Castro. His perspectivism is not part of a taxonomy of schemata, but a bid to recover an indigenous view according to which, while different animate beings see things in the same way, what they see differs. Consider this famous passage reporting beliefs widely held not just in South and North America, but across the world. I quote, "Typically, in normal conditions, humans see humans as humans, animals as animals, and spirits, if they see them, as spirits. However, animals, predators, and spirits see humans as animals, as prey. to the same extent that animals as prey see humans as spirits or as animals, predators. By the same token, animals and spirits see themselves as humans. They perceive themselves as or become anthropomorphic beings when they're in their own houses or villages, and they experience their own habits and characteristics in the form of culture. They see their food as human food. Jaguars see blood as manioc beer. Vultures see the maggots in rotting meat as grilled fish. They see their bodily attributes, that's fur, feathers, claws, beaks, etc., as body decorations or cultural instruments. They see their social systems as organized in the same way as human institutions are, with chiefs, clans, ceremonies, exogamous moieties, and so on. The consequence, at the end of quotation, the consequences of this cannibal metaphysics, as he calls it, in his latest book, are stunning. Social roles and culture are not limited to humans, but widely shared by other creatures. The political and ecological implications of that are obvious. Conversely, there's no domain of nature that identifies the stuff that everything is made of. Where we in the West assume mono-naturalism and multiculturalism, in the perspectivist ontology, culture is common as monoculturalism, and natures differ, multinaturalism. Now, a radical challenge such as this provokes some pretty sharp reactions, though it's good to remember that some of our Western metaphysics, with which this cannibal version is implicitly compared, have been pretty counterintuitive too. Think of Parmenides, the Greek philosopher, who denied change. That takes some doing. Or even Plato's theory of forms, the idea that the real reality is something that is only vaguely represented by perceptible particulars. The temptation is to dismiss these ideas as nonsensical. So as either the indigenous people or the ethnographers, or both, are seriously deluded. One notable anthropologist who's queried the data is Terry Turner, who questions who the original informants were, how typical or representative of their cultures they were, and doubting these metaphysical speculations when so much of their observed behavior is eminently practical. Then a second critique is to protest that even if these reconstructions were true, and that cannibal metaphysics is as Viveros de Castro says it is, we wouldn't be able to understand it. We would be dealing with incommensurable worlds between which no bridgehead of intelligibility is possible. The virulence of some riposts is testimony to how threatening these ideas are thought to be. It's as well to remind ourselves of some very much more familiar beliefs in our own societies. When I've discussed this in print or otherwise, I've often reminded Western audiences that Roman Catholics believe that in the Mass, the wafer and the wine are the body and blood of Christ. For the non-believer, the wine is still wine. For the faithful, blood. Not miles away, perhaps, from a Jaguar perspective, in my quotation, that blood is manioc beer. However, there's this difference, that the Christian Mass is a sacrament, thoroughly exceptional, while perspectivism reports what Jaguars standardly experience. But part of the problem stems from some implicit assumption of the absolute necessity of the postulate of nature. I first got interested in these issues when I started learning classical Chinese. Looking at Needham's pioneering studies in science and civilization in China, and following up what he translated nature in different contexts, I found that some 6 or 7 different terms were in play, none of which is at all an exact equivalent of our nature, or Latin natura, or where it all began, Greek physis. Sometimes the Chinese expression was tian, literally heaven, or tiandi, heaven and earth. Or sometimes they spoke of wanwu, the myriad things. Then qing and qing are used of the characters or characteristics of things. There's a great debate in the 4th and 3rd centuries BCE about whether human xing is good, bad, or indifferent. But we need to be careful. We're told in one text that the xing of water is to be pure, that of humans is longevity. Not exactly what the Greeks would have picked out as their physis. Then again, the Chinese show an interest in li, the patterns of things. And they use zeran, literally self-so, for what happens spontaneously, without human intervention. Modern Chinese adds the prefix da, great, to form da zeran, the normal word for translating Western nature. Where in my early writings I put it that the Greeks discovered nature, I came to see that it is more correct to say they invented it. But that captures the point that the writers responsible, the so-called physikoi, or naturalists, natural philosophers, used the term specifically to identify a domain of experience over which they were experts. The traditionalists might continue to believe that gods caused earthquakes and diseases, but they, the physikoi, the natural philosophers, knew better and understood that these were natural phenomena, each with its own natural cause. In practice, of course, their ideas of the actual causes of earthquakes and diseases were usually pretty wild. But they now had what I've called a weapon of mass intellectual destruction to see off the opposition, those who had no such idea of nature. Not that the physicist's idea of nature was value neutral. On the contrary, it was highly normative, as when Aristotle claims that the natural posture for animals is upright, despite the fact that so many of them are quadruped. He says that in human beings, the right side is naturally more right-sided than the right side of animals. My observations about ancient societies joins forces with the ethnographers at the point where I have to remark that nature, the explicit concept, was in no sense a given. Time and again, pursuing the question of what is being translated, nature, in ancient texts, outside Greek ones, or those indirectly or indirectly influenced by Greeks, I find that the original terms are being over-translated. That certainly doesn't mean that there's no understanding in the cultures in question of what we call the natural in the sense of the regularities of causes and effects. An implicit idea of what is natural in that sense is present every time a farmer sows seed to produce a crop, though many a farmer will also offer a prayer to help get a good result. But as I put it before, while culture, some concept of culture, is universal, usually with a sense that cultures differ, a notion that corresponds to nature isn't. Where does all of that leave us, or at any rate me? In a sense, all I'm doing is issuing one caveat after another about the original dichotomy. Does every human society have an explicit concept of nature? I would say no. Should they have had one? It seems that many have got along well enough without one, and have thereby avoided the confusions that arise, A, between a descriptive and a normative use of nature, the latter where what is natural is whatever we approve, B, on the question of what exactly nature in either usage is supposed to cover, and C, on just where we can be confident there is a clear boundary between nature and its various antonyms, the topic of increasing challenges in increasing domains, as I remarked at the outset. Let me point out that the ancient Chinese, with no overarching concept of nature as such, were not tempted to amalgamate what happens spontaneously, not subject to human intervention, with the issue of what humans are born with as opposed to how they are brought up. And both of those were the problems of the differences between humans and other animals and the question of our human capacity for morality and whether humans are intrinsically good, bad, or neither. The lesson from ancient China, at least, would be that a first step in the clarification of the issues is indeed not to run them together. But if we are as abstemious on this issue as I recommend, does that not scupper any claim to objectivity, to have access to reality, to do science? That takes me to my final set of remarks concerning the anthropologically sensitized philosophy of science I would like to advocate. Much like the nature-culture dichotomy, the realist-relativist one has been more of a hindrance than a help. Relativism shouldn't be seen as the bogeyman it often is. We're all relativists whenever we use comparative adjectives or have to admit that a judgment is relative to a point of view. Hotter than is relative to something else or to some standard, evidently. But that doesn't mean that anything goes. We need not be, should not be, relativists in that Feyerabенdian sense. For clearly it's not the case that just anything does go. Nor can anyone ever have believed that, even Feyerabend, or at any rate have acted on it. We're all liable to make mistakes, both a priori, 2 + 2 do not make 5, and empirical. But if we cannot be ultra-relativists, we cannot be naive realists either. There's no single reality out there, let alone one that is accessible independently of some conceptual framework. My comparative studies of colour and spatial perception have convinced me of what I have called the multidimensionality of the phenomena, to which I add that the ways they are investigated will always reflect a particular style or styles of reasoning or inquiry. So the realist-relativist dichotomy shouldn't be treated as a dilemma between mutually exclusive and exhaustive alternatives, nor do I allow the bogey of incommensurable worlds, between which no communication is possible, to deter me. Conceptual schemata differ radically, and not just when we travel to Amazonia. But that's not to say that we can understand nothing of what is being said or done. Understanding is difficult and never perfect. But as students of ancient societies and of modern ones, we can and do have a chance to learn. That we can make a beginning, ponder further, think of the implications, modify our ideas, are pretty good evidence of the revisability of even our deeply held assumptions. As I would suggest, we need to revise those that cluster around that unfortunate complex of the nature-culture dichotomy. Thank you.
Well, thank you for inviting me for the discussion. It helped me to clarify my thoughts about the relationship between culture and biological traits. My attempt to go into discussing culture is a consequence not of my practical scientific studies that I'm doing with animals, but since I'm living among men for over 80 years, my observation on that allows me to try and speculate something about the relationship between natural phenomena and culture. I'll start with the three topics I want to discuss. One, following my initial suggestions of the handicap principle, I ended up by suggesting a theory of signal selection, which suggests that signals are selected by a different selection mechanism than any other trait. The distinction is that any other trait but signals, you have to invest. But if you get it without investment, you still use it. But signals, if there is no need to invest in signaling, and everybody can signal alike, the signal loses its function. It gets into inflation. That is one thing. The second thing will be that I believe that culture can be also divided into signaling culture, which is the arts, music, and all the other things which do not contribute directly to the physical life of the human. And all the rest are like they are like signals. And the rest is like other practical traits in nature. And I suggest, and that is the third point I want to put out, is that the interaction between the two selection mechanisms, can achieve some things that one selection mechanism could never have achieved. And I'll go and try to widen my talk about these three things. So first, signals. As I have said, that a signal loses its function if there is no need to invest in it in such a way that some individuals can invest more in it and some cannot invest in it. And I will go into it directly, not from evidence from nature, which would have taken me longer time, but evidence from what I see in cultures. One signal, take currency. Currency is a signal of wealth. Once everybody has as much currency as it wishes, currency loses its function. Take decorations. Lace was used to decorate garments at the time that lace was done by hand. So people displayed their wealth by showing amount of lace they have around their necks and around their hands and in other small places on their garments. But once lace was made by machinery and became cheap, the fashion of having lace as decoration disappeared within a few years. And now lace is only used in undergarments, and I want to go into what is the signal in undergarments. It will take me more time. But I have the answer for it if somebody will be interested. Or take my personal experience. I was one of the first people to go to East Africa to see the animals. But my relatives wanted that I will bring musical instruments and weapons to show off that I've been in East Africa. And I was burdened with it. But now that everybody goes there, nobody is coming with all these artifacts because everybody can do it easily. So signals are selected by a mechanism in which if there is no need to invest, if there is no handicap in it to differentiate between signalers or the same signaler under different situation, the signal loses its function. I suggest that both selection procedures increase fitness. One, the one which is material, if you can invest less and get the same result, you are happy because you are left with the possibility to invest in other things. And you can still use a house if you get it free. You can still eat if food is free to everybody because it helps you. And you go on using these cultural traits, whatever they are. But in signaling, if there is no need to invest in them to show differences, they are losing the function. So one is increasing fitness or success in cultural dimensions by decreasing investment. The other one is increasing its fitness because of increasing investment. And these are two opposite things like the right hand and the left hand. Now, what is the relationship to culture? We have as I said, the practical ones, which is having a house, having food, having things to defend yourself from the climate, from neighbors or whatever. These are practical things. Whether you have to invest in them or not, you want to have them. And there are the cultural things, the music, the stage, the literature, and I will also include in it basic science, which nobody knows where it will lead. It is just an investment with no direct benefit to the people who are investing in it. So this is comparable to the signaling part in nature that I have studied. And the other things are the material, the practical aspects of culture in which the aim, why you want to have them, is very clear from the beginning, and you opt to get them and it decrease the investment in them. And then the interesting thing is what happens when the two cultures or the two signaling mechanisms interact with one another. The problem is how do you go from one aspect, strategy of life, into something, into another one? Like from using stones as artifacts or going into metal. Whoever starts to, among the successful stone, the people who are competing to be the best in the stone culture, will start to invest in playing with metal. It is investing in something and reduces his fitness into something which he will not know where it is going. So how you bridge the gap between getting advantage from one culture and starting to get an advantage from another culture, how it can be developed in the same place, not by copying another culture, because the gap cannot be bridged by small mutations that, as biologists, I believe that small mutations have to add to one another, and they are usually selected they appear randomly, and they are selected if they are an advantage. And in the beginning, playing with metal when you are using stones does not give you any advantage. So how? Still, it goes down into the situation that suddenly you can start to build a culture of metal and get something efficient from that. And I will illustrate that from biology this time. Ungulates, when they were fighting, the hornless ungulates bumped their head one against the other. And then some of them start to develop horns. But horns, in order to develop a horn, you need a lot of mutations until the horn will be a weapon. You have to have growing somewhere on your body a little bit of skin, then fill it with another part. And why to put it exactly here where the horns are efficient as weapons? Because in the beginning, when the mutation occurs, it can be on your hand, it can be somewhere, and there is no symmetry in it, and there is no shape in it. And this is a very basic problem to the development of a new thing, which is different from what you are using now in a completely different directions. And I suggest that the top ones in that strategy of life show off by investing and wasting their time, by playing with things to show off that they can be good, although they are wasting their time. That is the handicap principle. And that is not random, because you have to reduce all the time down and down and down to show off how good you are. Then some of this wasteful investment in show off may lead you to the point where you can use now to the base from which you can go and use another direction of culture. That is how I believe how things happened in animals. The horns start with little bumps around the eyes. If the bump is here, it doesn't show where I am looking. But if I have a bump here, you know where my eyes are, even the ones far away from me. And I can show to them that I am interested in them, whether I love them or whether I want to threaten them. And the farther they are, the longer are these bumps, and then only have to harden them in order to make them into horns. So these small mutations can lead from one peak of adaptation to the base of another peak of adaptation in biology, and I believe that the same thing can happen in cultures. That in order to show off, people start to look at things which are wasteful, look at the stars, look at do some funny things to show, although I am competing with you by having a stone culture, I can still play with other things which are a waste, and I am still better than you are. That is the handicap principle. And you play with iron not in order to make an artifact for efficiency, but in order to show off how good you are in the stone culture, until by chance you come to a place and you are already trained to use metals to try and make them into weapons or any other beneficial thing in the practical way of life. So I shall end up, because people ask me to say my things as in short, and those who are interested can read them in the only book I have written with my wife. And so to sum it up once more, natural selection, and this is something which is not yet accepted even by biologists, that is my theory, is happening by two distinct selection mechanisms. And I believe that since culture is also a biological phenomena, culture it can be divided also into two different mechanisms, the practical culture and the signaling culture. And everybody who is doing signaling culture says, I want to express myself. I want to express myself in dancing. I want to express myself in drawing. I want to express myself as a philosopher. I want to express myself as a basic scientist, somebody who is doing things that nobody is interested in. Just I am interested, I am wasting my time on something which is not useful. I don't have a target. So this is one, that is why I believe that culture can be divided into these two things. And the ability of showing off by wasting your time in something which is not practical, you can lead and come to a place where new practical things can emerge. Not every waste is going there, perhaps 1 in 100, perhaps 1 in 1,000. But this is the only way by which small mutations can lead you from one peak of adaptation, whether it is biology or culture, to another peak. And thank you very much for helping me by the invitation to point this out.
I would like to thank Orna for this opportunity to address this symposium, participate in this symposium. I'm truly honored to be invited to participate with these distinguished, very distinguished speakers. And I would like to thank Professor Lloyd for the book, because you brought me back to things that I'd studied as an undergraduate. I had the honor of taking a course with Brent Berlin, and he got quite angry at a question that I asked as an 18-year-old undergraduate about the functionality of color terms. He didn't like the question. And I appreciate the opportunity to formalize ideas which I've been cogitating on for the last 25 years since I began to teach stone tools. Ideas which normally would just come out over an arak in a pub with the students. And this is an opportunity to try to think about them in somewhat more formal terms. We've been addressing culture very much through through language. Culture as language, culture as ideas and concepts, which we structure through language. And I want to offer an alternative perspective. I don't want to dispute culture as language. I just want to offer something else, a different way of looking at it. And there will be those, I don't think any of my colleagues are here, but there will be those who will say that I'm anti-language because I'm linguistically challenged, and my students will agree, my students who I teach in Hebrew, my abilities to massacre the Holy Tongue. Stone tools are a really good means of measuring the origins and development, dare I use the word evolution, of culture. They're the only element of culture that goes back to our origins as humans, however you define that. We have stone tools that go back to 2.5 million years ago. And we have stone tools that continue through the human career up until now. Okay? There are still societies that use stone tools, and for any of you who still smoke, you're still using stone tools because your lighter is made of flint. It has a little piece of flint, and that's how you're setting your fire in your lighter. And that was how people made fire well into the 19th century, before matches became totally available. So stone tools offer us a record, a developmental record of culture over the course of 2.5 million years, roughly. And I just want to give you here the scale of time that I'm talking about. Okay? So we're talking about more than 2 million years ago, and of course that's East Africa, up through recent times. I've put down the origins of fire, which is around 1 million, and cave art, which is around 40 or 30,000 years ago. And these are the examples of the stone tools that I'm actually going to use as examples of the, again, development of human cognition through material culture. Material culture in this particular situation being stone tools. I've put together 4 variables which I want to look at for looking at the development of human cognition, of culture, over the course of these 4 million years. One is the ability to shape. Here I've called it, here you see no imposed symmetry. The ability to shape an artifact. That's really a kind of, what are you seeing? What are you actually doing? What are you aiming for? What's the conception? The complexity of the artifact. How many times do you have to actually hit it? We're talking about stone tools. We're talking about chipping stone tools, knapping flint. How long does it take to do it? What's the investment? The third variable actually is complexity. How many different kinds of activities do we need to actually create the tool? So we can do one activity, we can do chipping repeatedly, but it's really one activity, it's the reiteration of the same thing. When do we have to change that activity to get to another stage in production? And the fourth, my fourth criterion or variable here is, when do we put things together? When do things become more than the one piece? When do we use different technologies and different raw materials to get composite tools? So here you see in the earliest stages, the lower Paleolithic and the older one culture, we have very, very simple stone tools. They're called choppers. We get them in East Africa. We get them at Ubadia. We get them in the Negev. The first wave of people out of Africa brought these. We have them now in Georgia. And that's apparently about as far as we're going to get them before they develop into other things. That first wave, that first development of material culture in East Africa, and that first wave of people out of Africa. The second stage, or they're really divided into two stages, is our first sense of any kind of symmetry. So you see on this side, my right and left here get confused. Your left, we see the very beginnings of symmetry. And on your right, artifacts which actually have a template or a paradigm associated with them. So already, 1 million years ago, we're getting an aesthetic. We're getting a template construction in Homo erectus, or something related to Homo erectus, which is a major change. Now, it took 1 million years to get there, but it's a pretty significant conceptual change over that first chopper. Okay? This is already a level of abstraction. And I'm not going to review the different stages. You can see the variables here that I've indicated. But we have greater symmetry and shape control, greater number of blows, 3 stages of modification. It's much more complex instead of merely 2. And you can see this one only has 2 stages of modification. I'm not going to try to explain the terminology. I asked one of my friends to review this PowerPoint and the paper that accompanies it, which I'm not reading to you. And he said, nobody in the audience will know what decortication is. And after this talk, you still won't know what it is. But you can look it up. And finishing. So basically, initial work, by the time we get to those very beautiful hand axes on your right, we have initial removal of the external skin of the flint. We have a rough out, and then we have fine finishing. Okay? So we have 3 stages, 3 separate, distinct or discrete technologies, sub-technologies, types of work that are done, which is very different from the 2 earlier stages. We're still only dealing with handheld tools. Okay? By the way, functionally, these things are kind of like Swiss Army knives. They were used as knives, they were used as chopping tools, they were used as pounders, they were used for a whole range of different functions. By the time we get to the Middle Paleolithic, translating that, Neanderthals, early Homo sapiens, not quite us yet, we have very complex tool manufacture. Again, I don't want to go into the details of this, but we can define easily 4 discrete and separate stages in the actual production of the stone tools, sometimes 5. Okay? Furthermore, we're now getting hafting, very clear taking of 2 separate materials. That piece on your right is actually a spearhead, and we have very good evidence that those were hafted to spears. This is the first time we have that. A piece of flint and a piece of wood. 2 different things put together. That's also a leap in abstraction, a leap in conception. By the way, just for the record, that's a reconstruction that a student made. Okay, that's not original. And by the time we get to the Upper Paleolithic, modern people, it turns out that in terms of, this surprised me, I have to admit, in terms of these parameters that I've established, I don't see a difference. The levels of complexity, the levels of investment, the type of hafting, I don't see a difference. And we all know Neanderthals didn't have art. And modern people created the cave art. So we know there's a conceptual change. But I think this argues for the legitimacy of what I tried to do. I actually didn't pick up this change in the stone tools. Okay, we can pick it up a little bit later. But in terms of the cognition, in terms of how people did things, how people conceived of making their material culture, how they saw their material culture, how it functioned, we see very similar things between Neanderthals and modern humans. And by the way, I have to say, archaic humans use the exact same, archaic Homo sapiens, okay, the people from whom we are the direct descendants, shared the exact same material culture as Neanderthals. Neanderthals are a European dead end. But they were roughly at the same cognitive level as those early us. Okay? So what do we see with the rise of Homo sapiens? If I can't see differences, clear differences, in complexity in the stone tool assemblages, in stone tool technologies, what do we see? And here is, I think, where we come back to some of the points that Professor Lloyd has made. This ties into the previous slide. What we see is much increased rapidity of change. We see now constant change. Now remember, the population density differences between these earliest stages of people and the preceding stages are not great. We're still talking about band-level hunter-gatherers. We're not talking about large population groups. We're not talking about elaborate connections between them. Okay? We're still talking about very, very low densities of population. So the change in rapidity of change cannot be explained as a function of population increase. We all know now in modern society that density of population directly affects innovation. It would be very, very hard to argue that 40,000 years ago or 30,000 years ago. What we're seeing is a cognitive change. People are changing rapidly. They're able to innovate more rapidly, and they're adopting these changes. They're more open to the changes. That's a significant change. So that's one point. We have much increased human cultural diversity, which is a function of being human, it turns out. Okay? That aspect, of the very fact of diversity, is what makes us human. When I look at the stone tools, we can argue about everything else later. This is my case study on the stone tools. And these are just arrowheads. And what you see here, when arrowheads are introduced about 15,000 years ago, and the chipped stone arrowheads disappear about 6,000 years ago. So we have less than 10,000 years of chipped stone tools. And every few hundred years, every 200 or 300 years, we get a major change. And this is schematic. There are sub-changes as well. Every few hundred years, there's a total change in how people viewed their arrowheads. Okay, let's go on. The other thing, in addition to change over time, is that we have geographic variability, which didn't exist in the preceding periods. When I look at that Middle Paleolithic expanse, and I restrict myself to, well, let me not restrict myself, to where we have let's take out East Asia because we don't have materials. So from, say, Iran, west and south into Africa, where we have the Middle Paleolithic well documented, it all looks the same. I can take a spear point from Israel and take it into South Africa, and you couldn't tell the difference. And they'll be roughly contemporary. I can take a scraper from not Northern Europe, it's covered by glaciers, but from Italy or from France. I can bring it to Kesem Cave, which my colleagues here at Tel Aviv University are excavating, and I couldn't tell the difference. And yet when I move into the period of Homo sapiens sapiens, I can take, these are all axes. You can all identify them clearly as axes for chopping trees and for woodworking. And you can see intense variability between different regions. So, summing this up, what we have really is just a good quote. You know, we're in Israel, we should quote Genesis. What makes us human, if I'm looking for something to bridge this culture-nature divide, it's not there's no line. In fact, what seems to make us a little bit different is that we're diverse and that we innovate rapidly as Homo sapiens sapiens. And I will leave it at that. Thank you.
Scenery has changed. Now there's no one on stage because of PowerPoint. All right, it's a great privilege and honor to be here in this morning symposium for Professor Lloyd, and I would not dare try to say something very substantial about the question of the dichotomy between nature and nurture as it is reflected in the history of ideas. About that I can only learn from you, but I think I can say something that might be significant about some stuff that's happening to the dichotomy today in the set of fields within which I've been working, especially with respect to the question of language, the question of the essence of language, the evolution of language, and where language stands around that dichotomy between nature and nurture. So I would like to say a few words about that. Actually, a few notes. The first, which I think Eva is going to talk about a little bit more, and something that comes very, very strongly from out of our work together on the evolution of language, is that it may be the case that something slightly different is happening to the dichotomy as opposed to a continuous effort of deconstruction. Actually what is happening is some sort of causal reversal between these two terms. And in a way, it seems like the dichotomy is coming back to becoming a little bit more clear once we put it in the reverse order, in the following sense, that I think a major part of the way discourse over this dichotomy has taken place in the West was to start with a certain meta-theoretical assumption that says there's something that we can call human nature, and that is, it is the causal basis of whatever there is in the human sphere. It is universal, and it is given this way or the other, and we do not know how, and so on. And then we can talk about all kinds of cultural facts as resulting, again, this way or the other, from these things. So, for example, whereas the assumption would be that, other things being equal, we would like to think of nature as something that is simply, nature as something that is simply shared by all humans in some kind of universal way, we would say, okay, on the basis of that, we can have variable phenomena, such as cultural phenomena. In the last 50 years, in the investigation of language, this has been the position, and it's been formulated in very, very radical terms by Noam Chomsky and Jerry Fodor and a whole group of very influential thinkers. And I think that, yes, part of what has happened was that a lot of people tried to show that the dichotomy doesn't work. And I think that everything the people have done in this sense was extremely valuable, both in terms of looking, for example, at the question of how we get to know language. No, it's not the case that there's this genetically given universal grammar that we all share, which then allows for the diversification of language. Something much more complicated is happening in language acquisition in terms of the relationship between the child and the environment environments are different, and so on and so forth, all kinds of very interesting stuff. But the kind of idea that Eva and I are pushing towards, and other people are also pushing towards, is actually the idea of causal reversal in the following sense. Whatever we think about as human nature is actually, to a very large extent, a result of a cultural process that created at every point along the way new selection regimes for individuals, which means that in the long run, the way we are in terms of our biological nature, our genetically given nature, Eva will talk about epigenetics and the whole thing, in a very serious sense, these may actually be the result of the fact that we've been living in cultural scenarios for a very, very long time, and that we as individuals, generation by generation, have been selected in terms of our capacity to actually meet the challenges of society, of culture. Looking at the relationship between culture and nature in this way, first of all, helps a lot in explaining all kinds of stuff that I will not get into in here. But it also changes some of the most, I think, basic parameters of these ideas of what culture is, what nature is, and how we think about the separation or the dichotomy or the relationship. The first thing that comes to mind has to do with universality and variability, a very, very important parameter in this discussion. And again, in the last 50 years, we've gone through a pretty dramatic path. For example, the general assumption 50 years ago, again, a Chomskyan assumption, was because language is given to us in our genes, because it is part of our nature way before it has become involved in culture, whatever is natural about the human linguistic capacity should be the same for all human beings. So linguistic capacity at the level of nature is universal. Then we can find all kinds of variabilities between language, but at the end of the day, these variabilities are going to be at the margins. They are going to be phenomena that have grown wild to this extent or the other on the basis of something that is shared by everybody in all languages. What we know today, after 50 years of work that was actually paradoxically, or maybe not paradoxically, inspired very deeply by Chomsky's contentions, no one would do the kind of work that typologists are doing today, really going through sets of 800 or 1,000 languages looking for common denominators and so on, if it weren't the case that Chomsky put on the table such a very radical idea, saying behind all languages it's just the same thing. So what we know today about languages, for example, goes exactly with what you were saying before. Actually, the most impressive fact about human language is the extent to which it is diverse and variable. That is, one of the most important differences between the human capacity for language and other animals' capacity for other systems of communication is the extent to which our communication system, language, just one of the communication systems that we use, but this system is so variable. There's something very, very deep in the fact that we can have such variable languages. In the fact, for example, that many of the languages of the world are spoken by 5,000 people, less or more, very small languages. For a very long time, this has been thought of as a sort of fluke, right? But I think that we're now gradually learning that the essence of things is exactly there. The essence of language lies in the fact that you take a bunch of people and you put them together and you create a situation where they constantly have to engage in dialogue over what would be a consensual worldview with which they can work and talk and communicate, and the kind of thing that comes out of this process is always locally unique, is always something that reflects something very, very deep about the people and the place and so on, and is in some kind of dialectical relationship with that community. All right? We know today, for example, at a different level, that the most important, or one of the most important facts about language acquisition is its variability. 50 years ago and in certain quarters until today, the idea is that children come into the world and go through the process of language acquisition just in exactly the same way, because they are kind of programmed to go through stages of this type or the other. And we now know more and more that different children come into this process of language acquisition with different strategies, different ideas about what they should be doing there, different variabilities between their capacities, and children look for all kinds of different ways to meet the challenge of language, which is always the social challenge, the cultural challenge. It's out there. In a real sense, we can actually say something like the following. What is universal in the first place about human language? The most foundational question from that perspective. And it's been always totally assumed that when we're asking this question, we're talking about the mind-brain in this way or the other. So it doesn't matter what happens elsewhere. The fact of the matter is that every human being has language. Every human child is capable of acquiring language at a certain point in time. This is the foundation. But now I think we're gradually coming to terms with the understanding, which is almost shocking in its simplicity, that whereas there are human individuals with language and human individuals with less language and some human individuals without language at all, for each of which we have a good excuse, right? So we say here's the cognitive problem and here's the brain problem and here's the fact that this child has never been exposed to language in the critical ages and so on. There is no human society without language. We don't need excuses there, all right? The 100%, the foolproof generalization about the universality of language lies at the social, cultural level and not at the individual level. This reframes the whole question of linguistically related capacity. What does it mean that some people find it more difficult to cope with language than others. It means something totally different if we position language at the social domain, and then we ask, or cultural, and then we ask how different individuals manage to meet this challenge to variable degrees. For me, in terms of my own understanding of language, my theory of language as a communication technology, the most important element in all this, which I think is, in a way, I think directly related to your great interest in the meaning of concepts in different cultures, is the idea that when we want to ask the question of what is happening to language and with language in a community of individuals, we actually have to start not from the universality of the linguistic capacity, not even from the variability of what is happening at the cultural and social level. We actually have to start with the variability between the individuals who are part of the language community. First thing to note is here is a bunch of people who are looking at the world in slightly different ways, who have gone through different biographies, who know different things about what is happening around them, who have experienced different things with different people in different circumstances and so on. Okay? So potentially, each of these individuals lives in an experiential world that is in very many important ways different from all the others. And language from this point of view is actually a very sophisticated tool that we use in order to create some sort of common view of the world within the community. So language as a cultural phenomenon is actually playing the role of a unifying element within a community of individuals who without language would be more different from each other. Again, other things being equal, we always have to say that because there are many, many elements involved there. One of the things that would happen immediately if we all, at this very moment, stopped speaking, writing, talking to each other, giving advice, telling each other stories and so on, assume that we could do everything else exactly the same way. And I totally sympathize with what you're saying, what you were saying before. I think it's a very, very important issue. Human culture, human civilization, human sociality is not only language-based, and in many, many deep ways, it's based on other things, and language is a pretty late development that already builds, for example, on all the capacities of intersubjectivity that are involved in doing things together, like chopping stone tools, and most of the tools you showed, I think up to the last version of the Achillean tools, were probably made before language as we know it came into play. So there's a lot of stuff that we are capable of doing together without language. Very important to remember that. But assume that now we were banned from using language altogether. We just couldn't do that. Okay? I think that one of the things that would immediately come up in our subjective experience of the world would be we would fill the experiential gaps between us much more radically. We give us a certain time of not being able to talk to each other, and the understanding of how different we are would become stronger in many ways. And language as a system, as a technology, is designed, that's the theory that I'm developing, is designed by cultural evolution to systematically allow us to find common denominators in our worldviews and discuss them and create the sort of socially grounded view of the world that then allows for all the beautiful things that we're doing and also for all the horrible things that we're doing as human beings that we couldn't do without language and so on. We're creating a sense of collective epistemology through a system that allows us to systematically work together on the bridging of the experiential gaps between us. And this has implications for all kinds of issues, and of course I'm not going to have time to talk about all of them. I would just want to make one last remark about something that I think is coming out very, very strongly in Professor Lloyd's work, and that is the relationship between this conceptual analysis and historical and anthropological analysis of concepts and the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. To what extent can we learn something of importance about the relationship between the way we use our language and the way we actually think about the world? And there's also always an implicit assumption behind textual analysis that we have a certain view on that. Because otherwise, for example, if we assume there is no relationship between language and thought, the textual analysis would be of a totally different type. And what is happening from all, what is coming out from all this work, together with a lot of new work that's coming out on the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, is a situation where it seems that as humans, one of the things that makes us unique is that we have different levels at which we learn about the world, and we learn at all these different levels simultaneously, and most importantly, the different levels don't give us the same answers. So, if we experience the world on our own, or with people without language, with the people that we're living with in our daily lives, and so on, just like all the other animals with a central nervous system, we learn about what is going on. We make generalizations in our heads. We learn from experience what to do, what not to do, what is good, what is bad, and so on. The conceptual system that comes with language, which is a result of an entire historical process of experiential mutual identification between individuals in the community, gives us a different system. It is sometimes similar to what we've experienced, and it is sometimes not. And to the extent that it is similar to the world of our experiences, we find it more easy, comfortable to use the language when it is further away from the way we experience. Certain elements are more difficult to use, and so on. But we live in different epistemic worlds which are only partially correlated with each other. And in this sense, we can start talking about different scenarios in which, for example, in some of which language would very much strengthen the way we would look at the world experientially regardless of language. In some cases, language would educate us to look at the world through a certain conceptual prism and thus influence the way we actually experience, hence a Sapir-Whorf phenomenon. In some cases, language would simply tell us something about the world that contradicts whatever we know experientially, and in this kind of situation, we would either fall into a very problematic emotional situation. A lot of what psychologists do in therapy is exactly about that, finding of some way to do something about the gap between the way we feel and the way we're supposed to formulate our feelings in a language that's not ours. Sometimes we would throw away our experiences in favor of language. Sometimes we would let our experiences help us invent new means of language to change language so that it would look more like the way we think, and we get this entire process of change that is very, very important in the whole story. Thank you very much.
Everybody will fall asleep. Thank you very much, and it's really a great honor for me to give this comments and to celebrate Professor Lloyd's great work. I want to say something. Professor Lloyd, in his talk, said the sentence, "Nature is not a given." And this is what I want to talk about, really. I want to talk, and the subject, as you can see here, of my talk is the biology of culture. So what does it mean? It sounds like contradiction in terms, but of course it isn't. So I want to talk about, very briefly, of course, about 3 points that will make sense of this title, The Biology of Culture. I want to explain how culture changes nature. And I want to talk about how things that we learn and things we do culturally change the activity and morphology of the brain. And give one example, there are many now. I want to say something about, and this is happening in ontogeny during our lifetime. I want to say something about what happens to us within the society and the environment in which we live can change the way our biology works, gene expression, something that is called our epigenetic profile, and I will give a few examples of that. And what is interesting about this thing is that most of the time we're thinking about it in terms also of development, of ontogeny, of what is happening during our lifetime. But we assume this is not inherited. Only genes are inherited, DNA sequences. However, we know today that this is not always the case. And in many cases, in fact, this kind of epigenetic changes, epigenetic variations, which are induced and constructed through environmental and sometimes cultural phenomena, could be inherited. We have evidence for that in animals, not yet in humans, but I'm absolutely sure it will come. And the third thing is something that Danny touched, and that is how, through our cultural activities, we create new selection regimes which lead to a change in genetic constitution through selection. So let me start. I'm starting with a quote by Mithun and Parsons from 2008. By changing the cultural environment, each generation changes the brain of the next. Much of this occurs unintentionally, hence our description of the brain as an artifact of culture. However, when we deliberately seek to influence that developmental trajectory, such as by the provision of particular educational environments or dietary supplements, we are in effect turning the brain into a cultural artifact. What could they mean? Well, what they are meaning is really, they are talking about literacy. And they are talking about the way in which learning to read and write, which has happened happened in parallel in several cultures. Apparently, it was invented more than once. About something like 5,000 years ago. And the idea, and what people are doing now, is they're trying to see what literacy does to the brain. How does it change it? Now, the fact that it happened 5,000 years ago means that it is not the product of genetic selection. It's too short. And for many, and during this 5,000 years, most of the people, by the way, who knew how to read and write were very few. These were the elites. Only in the last 300 years or so is literacy really widespread. So we cannot talk about genetic selection for literacy. And the fact of dyslexia is a very good argument for saying, you know, it's not very well selected, because look at this. We have this variability in the ability to actually read and write. So let us look at this. Now, what we have learned about literacy, I will not go through this slide, I'm just going to, the bits in orange that you see on the brain are the bits that light up in people who are literate when they read and write. When they are shown, for example, letters, which means something, and they read them. When people who are non-literate, but absolutely normal, are shown these letters, these bits of the brain do not light up. So the first thing that we know is brain activity is different between literate people and illiterate people. And not only is it different, it's not spread all over the brain. When you are doing this you are using this technique of fMRI, you see that there is a particular bit of the brain in the left side, on the occipital cortex, which lights up. And it is a very interesting part of the brain with properties that have to do both with the ability to use language and the ability to, for example, recognize faces, recognize visual inputs. Now, the other thing that is very, very interesting, I have a series of quotes here. I want to point to one point which is very, very interesting. And that is that it is not just the activity of the brain that changes. Obviously, the activity of the brain changes when we do things. And when we do specific things, like reading and writing, it makes sense that the activity of the brain will change. What is interesting is that it is so specific. Now, the other thing that is interesting is that there are actually morphological changes in the brain. The corpus callosum, the bit that connects the two hemispheres, is thicker in people who read and write than in people who do not. And this is not just something that has to do with maturational changes. How do we know this? Because you could say, well, you know, we teach kids to read and write, and that's related somehow to this. This is not the case, because people were actually doing work in Colombia. Colombia, as you know, there were lots of political problems, and a lot of people went to the jungles and did their bit there, and didn't learn to read and write, and came out when the political situation changed, when they were 20 years old, and they were completely illiterate. However, they were cognitively normal people. So they were taken to school. But before they were taken to school, some of them were experimental subjects. They went through fMRI. They were put into the machine in order to see how their brains react to a series of visual signs like letters, and what happens to this brain as they learn to read and write. What happens to this brain in terms of activity and in terms of morphological changes. And what happened to these people who are already 20 years old is that they acquired, through this enculturation process, the right kind of activity, the typical kind of activity of literate people, and also the corpus callosum got thicker. So there's no doubt that there are changes in the brain as a result of enculturation. And we also know the very famous story of the British taxi drivers who have to have a very good spatial memory, because they have to know every bit of London and navigate the streets and so on and so forth. And when their brains were looked at, scanned by the fMRI machines, it was found out that their hippocampus, this is the bit of the brain which is very important for spatial memory, is larger than that of me and most of us here, who are not taxi drivers. So this is another example of the fact that culture changes the brain. It changes it physically. It's a physical, biological change. It has biochemical, and it has very strong biochemical correlates. Right. So now I want to talk about the second part. And believe me, there is a lot of stuff. Since this study on the taxi drivers, people have been put into the fMRI machines with all kinds of abilities, and you know, this is very well established. Okay. Now, here is something nice. I mean, most of the study that we have about epigenetics is the study of changes in gene activity patterns, which are induced usually by changes in environment, in environmental inputs, sometimes also just due to environmental noise. But basically, it is the changes in the activity of genes, in the way that they are expressed, rather in the DNA sequence of the gene. So, and usually when we're looking at what happens to this activity, and we want to look at long-term effects of this activity, usually we stress an animal, really give it a nasty kind of experience, and then see what happens to the gene expression patterns in its brain, and whether this gene expression pattern is afterwards inherited by its offspring and grand offspring. And unfortunately, often it is. And we know how to measure these epigenetic changes. There are many biochemical, there are different mechanisms of epigenetic, what is called epigenetic inheritance. And there are different types of epigenetic components that can be transmitted from one generation to the next. And we have now the biochemical tools which allow us to actually look at them and measure them. Now here is is an experiment with a more optimistic kind of feeling. That's why I gave it here. And that is that the mice were given 15-day-old mice were given an enriched environment. And we know that enriched environment is doing a lot of things to the mice, to the brains of these mice. And indeed, and in this case, this mice had a mutation which in normal condition makes their learning defective compared to normal mice. But when they had the enriched environment, in spite of the fact that they had this mutation, it was compensated. They could learn normally. And not only could they learn normally, there were epigenetic changes, but their offspring could learn normally. Unfortunately, it only lasted one generation in this case. But nevertheless, a very hopeful result. So a mutation, a genetic mutation, which usually causes a problem, was compensated through an environmental change. We can't talk about this being a cultural change in the mind. It is a cultural one from our point of view, of course. Now, this is another one which is giving us a more detailed analysis in terms of the epigenetic effects. It's again done on mice. This one is one of the unhappy ones, the ones where we stress the animals. We stress mothers and offspring, young mice, at critical ages, and we are looking to see what happens to them, to this offspring, to this young, as they grow up, and what happened to their offspring and to their grand offspring. So we're looking at first generation, second generation, third generation, and we're trying to see what happens. And what we find is that the stressed mice became mice with lots of psychological problems. Not something very surprising, I guess. If you stress somebody when it's young and you stress it badly enough, this is what happens. So they really get stressed. They really become a little bit neurotic. But not only are they neurotic, their offspring are also neurotic, which is bad news. In other experiments, it was shown that the offspring are not exactly neurotic, but they are more prone to be neurotic. That is, under some conditions of stress, they show they are less robust, less canalized than normal mice whose parents were not stressed. And we know, in this case, much more about the biochemistry. That's why I gave it, because it's a beautiful example of a very important work where we are beginning to uncover the biochemical details of what is going on. And we're learning more all the time. Now, the last example that I want to talk about, and what I want to say before I go to the last example, what I want to say about this is, one, we have examples in humans where we know that there are epigenetic changes in the brains of people who are extremely stressed as young children. For example, people who committed suicide because they were sexually abused as young children. And when compared to people who committed suicide for another reason, there are many reasons to commit suicide, unfortunately, but when these two groups were compared, those who had this very severe sexual abuse had different epigenetic profiles in their brains. And this was 20 years later. We also know that the effects of things that happen in humans, that the effects of what happens during pregnancy, the pregnancy of the mother, for example, starvation, has effects on the children, on their children, and on their, to some extent, lesser extent, there are beginning to be studies that show that there are also some effects on their grandchildren. It's going down. But it's not just one generation effect. So again, and here we're talking, for example, about wars, very, very culturally induced kind of phenomenon, the stress of war. We're talking about the case of the starvation of the Dutch population during the Second World War, when the Nazis stopped food arriving to Amsterdam and the area, and the people were living on something like 600 calories a day, and pregnant women were also starving. And since in the Netherlands we have very, very good health system and everything is registered, and so one can follow this, and we know that the offspring of these mothers, in different trimesters of their pregnancy, had a higher risk to develop all kinds of diseases, from heart diseases to schizophrenia. And I think that it is very important. Unfortunately, we live in a world in which There are a lot of problems of starvation, of war, of chronic stress, and to see what happens, not only to the generation that suffers through it, but also to the next generation is very important. And maybe, who knows, it will convince politicians, I don't really believe it, of course, to do something about it. Right, so now I want to talk about the third example, the third aspect of the way in which culture changes biology. And this has a lot to do with what Danny was talking about, but I will give a simpler example, and a well-known example, the example of the spread of something that is called the lactase gene. The lactase gene is a gene that allows us to break lactose, the milk sugar, into its ingredients and use milk as an energy source. Now, this spread of this gene is a recent phenomenon in humans, and it is related, we know, now, not every population, by the way, has it. It is common and very frequent, the frequency of these genes, in those populations that use fresh milk. And it is associated strongly with the domestication of cattle. So what we know here is that dairying was, the domestication of cattle occurred something like 7,000 years ago, something like that. We don't know exactly, 7,000 to 5,000. Dairying was practiced in some populations, not in all populations, and dairying and the use of fresh milk was practiced in a fraction of the population that actually used milk. In some populations, milk was only used as yogurt or as already processed product, not as fresh milk. Now, what we see is that in those populations that used fresh milk, there is a high frequency of the gene for breaking lactose, and and there is a lot of work about it, but the work sort of converges on the fact that it is correlated very strongly with the domestication of cattle, and it is the domestication of cattle that preceded the selection for the lactose gene. So the domestication of cattle created conditions where people in some populations and for local reasons used fresh milk. Because they used the fresh milk, there was a selective advantage for having the gene who can break the lactose and can use this as, and the milk can be used as an energy source, because normally, in normal people, once we are weaned, once we stop drinking our mother's milk, this gene is not expressed. Right? So the gene is not expressed normally, except in those populations, now in many populations of the world, but not all, where it is, when the gene is expressed, and this is the result of mutation. So this mutation spread as a result of culture. Culture created the condition for the spread of this mutation. Now, a very similar thing is happening with respect to something very interesting, sign language. Sign language, which was introduced to the United States about 200 years ago, has changed the genetic constitution, apparently, of part of the population. How did it do it? Right. Before sign language was introduced, people who were deaf and mute were considered to be retarded and were treated as retarded. They didn't, very often, they didn't marry, they didn't produce kids, and their fitness, if we talk in biological terms, was rather low. Now, as a result of the introduction of sign language, two things happened. First of all, these people were treated more as human beings who can be mates and who can be partners in all domains of life. And the second thing was that people who were mute and deaf tended to marry other people who were mute and deaf because with them they could communicate best. Now, the most common type of mutation which leads to deafness, there are at least 30 of them, is something called connexin. That's why it's called connexin deafness. And as a result of deaf-mute people marrying each other, the frequency of connexin deafness went up. Why? Because the connexin deafness is what biologists call a recessive mutation. You need 2 copies of it in order to be deaf-mute. If 2 deaf-mute people who are likely to have connexin deafness are married, the chances are that their children too will be married. And therefore, connexin deafness is going up in the population for 2 reasons. One is this kind of non-random mating between connexin deafness carrying gene, people who carry gene, and because deaf people are treated like human beings and as potential mates. So this is a very, very cultural change which changed the genetic constitution of the population within a very, very short time. Here is how quickly, when you're looking at the graph up there, it's a theoretical graph based on the data. You can see how quickly it has changed. And this is something to do with the evolution of language that Danny was alluding to, and that is that, again, what is happening when we're thinking about a lot of the kind of things that happen, the thing that we call cultural, and in general the thing that we call cognitive, is that the plasticity of the brain and behavioral plasticity is enormous. It goes beyond what was selected. Here we have Kanzi, a bonobo chimpanzee, who has been taught to communicate through symbolic symbols, through lexigrams. Now, I'm not going to go into the discussion of whether or not Kanzi really knows language or doesn't know language. It's not of interest to me at the moment. But what I want to say is that for sure Kanzi can do something that its mates in Zaire, who have not been taught to read and write, to communicate in this way, cannot do. We can stretch the plasticity of the brain, and then the genes can follow. Culture and changes, plastic changes in development, usually, not always, but usually precede genetic changes. Genetic changes are the cart that runs behind the genetic, the developmental horse and the cultural horse. Thank you.
I think we have just a little bit of time, and I've said I'd like to say something in reaction. I find this inspiring. Here we are, we've got specialists in so many different domains, in linguistics, in archaeology, in biology. I'm the sort of kind of specialist in historical anthropology. Now, this work has impact in so many different ways. We can understand more about what it is to be a human being. We can understand more about the interaction between individuals and society. We can understand the consequences of policies. There are all sorts of important implications that we can learn, but we will only learn if we have the opportunity to cross the disciplinary boundaries that academia presents to us. That's to say that the best way of making the most of these startling, inspiring developments in so many different areas is to make sure that the lessons that are being learnt in one discipline travel. It's a bit like, you know, these genes, the lactase gene is one thing, but what we need is it were the interdisciplinary gene to travel and to break down the barriers of academia. But I must say, I was excited throughout the whole morning, and I find the whole experience incredibly inspiring, provided that, of course, we do learn, and we learn, as I've said in what I said yesterday, we try to learn to avoid the mistakes that are so easy to make. Thank you.
Well, I would like to thank all the participants, Javi Ablonka, Danny Do, Steve Rosen, Amot Zehavi, and first and foremost to thank Geoffrey Lloyd for everything he gave us in the work that he done for the past 4 decades. I would like also to thank Smadar Fisher from the Dan David Foundation for helping me to organize this event, and to the audience for coming to hear us.